Tonight's guest for Yakety Yak is a great Western Australian. He is, of course, the Chancellor of the University of Western Australia. I am delighted to say he heads the Advisory Council of the Centre for Social Impact in Perth. And he is, of course, much, much more. And that we will discover tonight when Michael Chaney meets our interlocutor, Peter Thompson. So please welcome them for this next edition of Yakety Yak.
Michael, thank you for agreeing to put your head on the chopping block here.
Not at all, Peter.
We're in safe territory, though. We're in the suite of NAB, so there'll be plenty of people here to protect you.
Well, that's right. If the questions are too hard, only I know the combination to get out.
We have one thing in common I haven't mentioned. I have a father called Fred and an older brother called Fred. So we have Freds in common. Fred Chaney Sr. was a minister in the Menzies government.
That's right. He was. He was Minister for the Navy. Dad went into Parliament in 1955 and was defeated in, I think, 1969 when there was a big swing against the coalition. And he was, during that time, government whip and then Minister for the Navy for about 3 years.
Now, he had a close scrape with the Melbourne slicing through the Voyager.
Yes, he had the misfortune to have been announced as the new minister, and between then and when he was sworn in, the Melbourne collided with the Voyager, and a lot of people lost their lives. And so his period in the ministry was really dominated by the issue and by the Royal Commission that ensued and so on.
There were lots of moral questions that he faced as minister. When you think about it, there was so much at stake. He was opposed to the idea of a Royal Commission.
Well, he was, yeah, he really took a position early on, a very supportive position of the service people, the people in the Navy, and in due course, I think that was a difficult position because the Royal Commission found negatively against some of the personnel there. And actually it had quite an effect on his career, I think, as a minister.
So he had been trained as a teacher, like your mother, both school teachers. Your mother a drama teacher?
Yes, a drama teacher. Mm.
Did she, was she good at dramatics?
Oh, she was very good at dramatics, and she was an elocution teacher as well, so she would make sure that our grammar was correct all the time and that we spoke from whatever you're supposed to speak from the diaphragm, and we didn't mumble and so on. So, but she was a very wonderful influence on all of us, I think.
And you were the fifth of 7 children?
I was, yeah. I had a sister and then a brother, a sister, a brother, me, another brother and a younger sister.
So you're well down the pecking order.
That's right, I was. Where
did the famous Chaney renown for giving service come from?
Well, I think it's kind of you to label it famous. I think it was a fact that there was always an expectation of providing service to others. Unspoken, like most of the things in our family. Dad never really lectured or gave advice or direction, but his was a life of service. Having been in the Air Force and decorated in there, he became president of the RSL in the early 50s and then went into Parliament and had that 14-year stint in Parliament. He was subsequently Administrator of the Northern Territory, Lord Mayor of Perth. Fred, in the meantime, followed on in public life and went into Parliament and was Minister in a number of portfolios. And my sisters were always involved in things outside their jobs, whether it was church service or charitable works. And there was an unspoken expectation, I think, that you would that people should provide service to other people. I think another influence in my life was the Christian Brothers, who subsequently, unfortunately, were maligned for some, I think, the actions of a very small minority. I always found them people who were absolutely dedicated to the service of others, educating boys in this case, and had devoted their lives to it. And again, it was it was just sort of in the background. That's what people did, and I think it certainly had an influence on me.
Fred, your brother, is 9 years older than you, so that's quite a separation in age, and obviously had a towering impact on you.
He did, and I think all my siblings did, as did my parents. And as I mentioned, there was never any direction and very little, if any, criticism. In fact, I really don't recall my father ever criticising anything I did, and certainly with my mother. So it's a very supportive environment. But having a brother like Fred and my sisters, who were all pretty high achievers, I think gave you a sort of a personal expectation that you should, for example, go to university. That was the natural thing to do. It also presented some challenges in the sense that they were high achievers, and one naturally feels, gosh, can I do the same thing?
I know you've mentioned elsewhere that nurturing environment enhanced your self-esteem, not necessarily your self-confidence. You made the distinction between self-esteem and self-confidence.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the most important thing you can give a child is self-esteem. That is, a belief that you're a worthy person. And even if you're not achieving as much as someone else, that's the way it is, you're still worth something. Self-confidence, I made the differentiation probably in the previous conversation we had. I always saw as something different and something that can sort of tip over into egotism and pushing yourself forward and so on. And I always thought one of the important qualities of a CEO, for example, was having a fair dose of self-doubt. Interestingly, I read a study on that some years ago where the person conducting the study had expected to find, when he went to interview CEOs, that they were full of self-confidence and self-assurance and so on, and in fact found that they were often full of doubt, beset by doubt and questioning what they were doing. And I think that's a very healthy thing, that if you go forward always confident that what you're doing is right, you tend to listen less to what people around you are saying. Maybe
Having self-doubts, but also being willing to advocate unpopular views. That's another observation you've made.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, and I think that's actually something that does, in me, derive from my family upbringing. You know, Fred kind of made his reputation on expressing views that sometimes were unpopular and standing on a principle, and I think I've tried to do that. At times, it may have been too hard to do it, but I think it's a very important thing to do.
I just want to jump out of that conversation about your early influences and come to the present. You're about to have a big birthday. 2 weeks from
50?
You're a banker, aren't you? Should get the maths right.
Yeah.
It gives you time to reflect. And in looking at your life story, it's a story of remarkable achievement. What's given you most satisfaction out of the things that you've done, and what sews together the threads?
Well, I think, I'd have to name two particular areas. One is family. We've got 4 children who are all terrific kids, and having brought them up, and the youngest is now 27, I think they've all developed well and they have a good set of values and so on, and so I see that as one of the satisfying things in life. The other one is my career, and particularly in Wesfarmers, where the success of the company was beyond any of our wildest dreams, and I was there for a bit over 20 years, and it went from a company worth about $30 million to $15 billion, and it was a lot of fun through the whole process. We built up a really good team of people, and I think had a very singular focus on shareholder returns and achieved more than we hoped to achieve. So it's a very satisfying thing. And I think actually that focus on shareholder returns is consistent with what we were talking about earlier, a sort of mentality of serving others rather than yourself. And that's what's characterised Wesfarmers really under a number of chief executives for several decades.
We'll come back to that, to the various parts you've just mentioned. But wind the clock back. When you were in your early 20s, you joined the Liberal Party and you thought about going into politics, didn't you?
Well, I did. I joined the North Perth branch, which was sort of a place of intellectual foment. You know, it had people like Fred in it and Terry O'Connor, who became a QC, and a whole lot of other luminaries who sort of concentrated on this branch, and I joined it, and I must say my thoughts of going into politics didn't last very long, because I quickly came to the view that that wasn't really where my skills lay when I compared myself to the other people that were in there. And I also didn't really care for what I saw further in parliamentary life, for example, the need to compromise all the time and the difficulty of actually having an idea and following it through. And without thinking all that consciously about those sort of things, I went off in another stream.
The other stream at first was geology.
It was, yeah.
If you were a sort of you didn't make a great success of early days in politics, nor did you as a student of geology.
You're right. I did. I started a science degree in 1968. Why did I do science? Well, I'd got good results at school, and I could have entered any course, but there was a nickel boom on at the time, and Fred had a good friend named Bill Burdett who had done geology, and I thought, well, he seems like a good bloke, good judgment, I'll do geology. So I did that, and in first year I coasted because I'd got good school results and I managed to get through with mediocre results. And then in the second year I met my wife-to-be, and I failed every subject that year. I continued on and graduated, and I worked very happily as a geologist for 8 years after that, and at the end of that did an MBA part-time and then moved into commerce.
Just before we slip away from those straight failures in your second year of geology, it was an interesting insight into your father.
Yes, you're right. Dad said to me, as I mentioned earlier, he never gave any negative feedback. And I sort of shake my head about this now because having been a father, I know how hard this is. But he said to me as I was going out, "Oh, where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going down to uni to check my results." He said, "Oh, give us a call when you get them." So I went down, and in those days, Bill, in the Undercroft, they put all the results in the glass windows. And if you didn't pass any units, they didn't actually put your name up there. So I found my name wasn't there, so I sort of thought maybe they've got it out of alphabetical order. But no, my worst fears were realised. So I got on the phone and I said to Dad, he said, "How'd you go?" I said, "I failed every subject." And he replied, "Those bloody useless socialist lecturers, they wouldn't have a clue." And my reaction to that was, the poor guy, I'd better actually do something about it next year.
So it was one of those moments.
Yeah.
Burma Oil, which takes you to Houston, because the nickel boom's over. You actually do some financial courses there, which is your first exposure to finance.
Yeah. I went off to Houston working as a geologist, and while I was there, I think I saw an ad in a paper saying, "Come to a night course to learn about the stock market," and there was a Merrill Lynch executive who was running these at his home for 4 or 5 people. I realised at the end of the course it was a marketing exercise, because he said, "Now, I invite you all to come back individually and bring me your statement of assets and liabilities, and I'll give you some advice." And so I went back a week later and sat in his lounge room, and I gave him my statement of assets and liabilities, and he said, "Is this it?" But it sparked my interest in finance, and in fact the first spark had been when I was doing my geology degree. I did an assignment on economic geology, and I got the top mark, and it should have occurred to me then, commerce might be of interest here, but it took me really 8 years to realise that, and I then started an MBA, I think because I felt that it would give me another string to my bow, and I could probably not have to move around the world as a geologist for the rest of my life. But as soon as I started it, I was passionately interested, and I compressed the 4-year course into 3 years and got straight A's and topped the course. So it was the old story. If you're interested in something, you'll do really well at it. And I realised then, while I actually loved geology and my working life as a geologist, I wasn't nearly as interested in it as I was subsequently in commerce.
So you transition out of the oil and mineral industry as with Hud Bay. You joined the AIDC, the Australian Industry Development Corporation,
Yeah.
and then you come over and set up a Perth office for it.
I did. I joined AIDC, which was a government-owned investment bank, if you like. They were involved in providing financial advice and also lending money and coordinating loans to things like the North West Shelf project, the Cooper Basin gas fields, coal loaders and coal mines and so on. So it was a really useful transition from a technical career via an MBA into a commercial career where you needed to have some technical knowledge. And it was a fabulous organisation, government owned, the most profit-orientated organisation I'd seen, maybe now bar Wesfarmers, but really well focused. And I think I got just terrific experience there. And I came, after 8 months in Canberra, I came back to set up the office in Perth, which I must say was a bit of a challenge because I'd been a geologist only recently, and now I was required to go out and network with people and offer them, financial advice and loans and so on. And I remember in the first 6 or 9 months thinking how difficult that was when you really try to come to grips with it yourself.
One of the things this satisfied was your obvious desire, you and Rose's desire to have your children in Perth growing up in Western Australia.
It was. In fact, if it weren't for her influence, I think I would have gone back. AIDC kept asking me, when you're coming back to Sydney? And I'd say, I've got more work to do here in Perth at the moment. And eventually the offer came from the Wesfarmers Co-op to become company secretary. And I took that, I think, largely because she was keen to stay in Perth and I was pretty interested in it too. And I remember thinking then, at the age of 30, this is the first time in my career I've known where I'll be in a year's time. And I found that, I got some comfort out of that, I think. And I must say, looking back, it was a great decision.
Well, the magic started. You joined as company secretary, went into finance, became financial director. When you joined, the organisation was still a co-op. It was just about to go public, wasn't it?
It was. In fact, it was small, and one of my jobs in AIDC had been advising Bunnings, which was a bigger company than the co-op then, on building a new sawmill down at Dardanup, and I'd built a financial model and provided advice to the finance director at Bunnings. And when I took the job at Wesfarmers Co-op, I rang these two fellows excitedly and said, Peter and David, I've got some news. I'm joining Wesfarmers as company secretary. And there was a silence at the other end of the phone, and then one of them said, if you were telling us you were going the other way, we'd congratulate you, but this sounds like a big retrograde step in your career, because it was a relatively small company. But we listed it a year later, and it then went like that, as I said, beyond any of our wildest dreams.
So it was reasonably unusual. I suppose at the very beginning this was the era of conglomerates, but the notion that the conglomerates were the great way to go in terms of business strategy, soon the wheels fell off that idea.
Well, interestingly, I did my MBA in 78 to 80, and then we learnt that conglomerates were not a good idea. And I think for every year over the next 25 years, I would have read somewhere that conglomerates are a bad idea. We outperformed every other company in the Australian Stock Exchange over that time, and almost every other company in the New York Stock Exchange. And I always thought the reason we outperformed, one of the big reasons, was that we were a conglomerate, not in spite of it, because it gave us the ability to be quite dispassionate about which direction we followed, and to take a very strong financial focus and say, if the numbers add up and we think we can run this, we'll do it, even though it's not one of our existing businesses or it's not one of our bigger existing businesses. And so we were dispassionate about direction, and were able, I don't think it's any coincidence that when we were focused on on return on investment in the business, our shareholders got the best return on their investment.
So the most famous of the conglomerates over that period, the last 20 years, has been GE, probably.
Yeah.
And famously, they have the notion under Welsh that they'd need to be one or two in the industry, or they'd exit the industry.
Yeah.
How would you contrast your strategy with
Well,
that?
I used to reckon they were full of buzzwords, really. And, you know, Jack came up with those sort of slogans every couple of years. It'd be one or two in your industry, then it'd be destroy your business, it'd be something else. And I always saw that as a particularly American sort of approach to it. We took a quieter approach, and as I say, it was a financial focus, a very strong shareholder focus. And we had some businesses that were way smaller than one or two in their industry that were the most profitable in the industry because they were in very profitable niches, like our insurance business. And so we didn't really have any rules like that about size, being one or two. We simply had rules about making every dollar earn its keep and return on investment. And I think there was a large element of that in GE. But GE, in fact, ended up with a very dominant part, and that was GE Finance, which took them through and gave them fantastic growth over several decades, but of course became a huge problem during the GFC. And I think it's perhaps an illustration of, if you like, perversely, the benefit of diversification. If you become too dominant in one area and too influenced by one area, then you're more vulnerable. Whereas if you've got a broad spread of activities and investments, then you're less vulnerable.
Of course, Friedman popularised the idea of maximise shareholder value as a slogan, I suppose, in an academic sense, and that's what you were subscribing to as a business philosophy. Interestingly, back in the 80s in business schools, there wasn't much time given to the notion of corporate social responsibility. Yet you've been quite sympathetic to that idea at the same time, and those things have often been seen as working in opposite directions.
Yeah, and I never saw them working in opposite directions. So it seemed to me, if you're going to succeed in terms of shareholder wealth creation in the long term, you had to be socially responsible, and you had to be, if you like, a leader in corporate social responsibility. I should, just as an aside, say that when we first started saying we only have one objective, and that is to provide a satisfactory return to shareholders, some people, well, there are two groups of people. Investment specialists would say, and what? What's your vision? You know, we'd say, that's our vision. People who are, if you like, on the social side will say, well, you mean you do anything for a buck? Our response was no. If you look at our annual report, it has this single objective. The reason it has that, by the way, is that why else are companies established? People don't establish companies for social benefits. They establish them and they buy shares in the stock market in them because they hope they'll get a better investment return than buying shares in another company. So that's the objective. But if you look at the annual report, it says we aim to achieve this by making sure our employees have a safe and fulfilling working environment, making sure we look after our customers, making sure we care about the environment, making sure we contribute to the society in which we work. We see those as necessary strategies, if you like, if you're going to achieve good long-term returns. And I think more and more it became obvious that unless you were socially responsible, you'd lose your licence to operate, you wouldn't get the support from the community that you required, whether it was customers or people viewing your takeover and so on. And if you did have a reputation about caring for all of those other things, you'd get that support and you're more likely to do better.
Was there a robust debate inside Wesfarmers about that?
There never was, actually. There was, from the very start when we went public, when Trevor Eastwood was CEO, and we established this objective, the single objective, we never had any doubt about it. We did qualify it, or at least put those descriptors there, because of the sort of comments that we knew we'd get or we were getting. But we had absolute singularity of purpose, I think, throughout the organisation, and I think that's persisted now for over 25 years.
Have you lain awake at night worrying about these sorts of issues?
I've lain awake at night worrying about reputation. Reputation, I think, is really critical for a company, and we had some instances where our reputation was under threat. One of them was the forest industry, where we were the main contractor in the forest. The forests were managed by the government agency here, but we were the contractor logging the forests and then taking the products and sawing them up or wood chipping them. We were confident for the whole time we were in that industry that it was environmentally appropriate, that it was good for the forests in the long term, that sufficient areas of forest were in reserves, and they were vast areas in reserves that could never be touched. And we were confident that the politicians would continue to support that position because that was the fact, and the expert foresters were working for them and so on. In the end, the Greens ran such a successful campaign, and I might say, and I've said publicly, a misleading, dishonest, deceptive campaign, that 80% of the public believed them and agreed with them, and therefore believed we were doing the wrong thing. And people would say to me, you know, Mike, how can you morally justify being involved in this dreadful industry? And amongst those people were leaders of our community who I think had been seriously misled. In the end, we got out of the business. We just said, we can't afford to be in this because, notwithstanding what we believe is right, this is affecting our reputation, and it's going to affect the rest of our businesses, and we have to leave. And I've sometimes thought one of the less moral, ethical decisions I've made as a CEO was to get out of the forest industry, because we essentially turned our back on the people that were working for us. We sold the industry, the bits and pieces off. But the, if you like, more ethical thing, I think, would have been to take a bigger stand, keep fighting and so on. But in the end, we realised, we believed that it was counterproductive to do that, and you weren't going to win it anyway.
You've said that being chair is not nearly as much fun as being CEO.
I don't think I said nearly as much fun. I might have said as much fun.
All right.
And?
Well, I want you to fill in the end. Why is that so?
I enjoy it. I do enjoy being chairman of NAB and Woodside, and down at the university as well, being Chancellor. It's not as much fun in the sense that when you're a CEO, you are very actively involved in developing a team and day-to-day interaction with the team members. And if you have a good team and you have a good sort of culture, and I'd describe that as one where you all have the same sort of focus, in this case shareholder returns, and you have a lot of fun doing it, it's a pretty enjoyable life, you know. And if you're doing well as well, because the better you do, the more you feel we're doing things the right way, and the more enjoyable it is. As chairman, you're necessarily more distant from it, and I've got a very strong view about directors not trying to get involved in the management of companies. And that means that you're not there on a day-to-day basis. People are doing things their own way, and your ability to influence them while it's there as chairman is not nearly as strong as it is when you're CEO. So it's those sorts of things. And you know, as a CEO, you're in there, the daily cut and thrust, and it's a pretty exciting life if things are going pretty well.
Stepping down as CEO, not that you actually, there was overlap with these things, but I'm just wanting to focus for a minute or two on the things you've done outside business. The Fiona Stanley persuaded you to take on the initial chairing of the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth.
Yeah, yeah.
Why did you buy into that?
Well, Fiona's very persuasive. And I said to her, I haven't got much time, and the usual sort of response, I'm not sure I can do this. Fiona said to me, and I didn't know Fiona as well then as I do now, but she said to me, I was with John Howard last week, and I said to him, who do you think I should get to head up this new organisation to solve all the problems of children and youth? And he said, Michael Chaney, you must get Michael Chaney. Well, now I know Fiona better. This is what would have happened. Prime Minister, I'm just wondering who to get to head up my new organisation. And I was thinking of Michael Chaney, what do you think? And John would have said, sure. So, what do you reckon, Peter? I think sounds like a good idea. So anyway, she persuaded me to do it, and it was a terrific involvement actually, because and the whole thrust of this was that, notwithstanding all of the effort that's put into fostering our children and our youth and so on, government programs, all of the indicators are going backwards, whether it's obesity, youth suicide, all of those things were going backwards. And the belief that one of the reasons was that there was no coordination between policymakers and researchers and practitioners, and that if you managed to get all of those heads together, you'd get a much bigger bang for your buck, and you'd get much more effective legislation and more effective outcomes and so on.
Well, this brings us to the issue of the third sector, which can do things in a way which governments and businesses can't. Is that what you believe?
Well, yeah, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Maybe you could elaborate on it.
Well, governments are boxed in by having to do things on a mega scale. The third sector is much more flexible. It's much closer to its customers often than governments are. If you use that term, customers, relationships.
I'm not
children, for example.
Yeah, I don't think the third sector's more capable and able to do things than the corporate sector, for example. I think the corporate sector's vastly more able to get things done than in the government sector.
But it's busy elsewhere.
Yeah,
the corporate sector.
Yeah, if you're talking about social involvement and so on. And the third sector, yeah, I think you've got people generally in that sector who are pretty open-minded and almost universally have a belief in what they're doing, that it's for the public good, and that they'll consider all sorts of alternatives to get it done.
Think of the Aboriginal Employment Initiative. And I was here last year for the Ernst & Young Social Entrepreneur of the Year Award, which went to the forests. There's an example of business, and substantial business, actually getting involved in the third sector in a very active way.
Well, it is, and I think it's fantastic how that's changed over the last decade. You know, the attitude in the early 90s, when there was a report about the dire circumstances facing a group of Aboriginal people, the attitude was pretty common that the response in the corporate sector was, or individuals in the corporate sector was, well, gee, we've thrown all this money at them and they're wasters, and you know they've done nothing to help themselves. There's a total sea change in that sort of attitude. I think the attitude now is very widely, if not universally, is there's a huge gap here, for example, in life expectancy. There are very unsatisfactory conditions people are living in. What can we do about it? What's been done to date hasn't seemed to work very well. What can we do differently? And so you'll find, I think there are now 200 organisations who've done reconciliation action plans, where, and NAB and Woodside are two of them, where they're setting out actions that they can take to try and close the gap and so on. And that might be employing people, it might be cultural programs within the organisation to help people understand the issues, it might be providing finance and financial education to Aboriginals and so on. So I think it's very encouraging to see what's happened, and you've had, as you referred to, a few initiatives by people. Prior to Andrew's initiative, there were, of course, many companies employing significant numbers of Aboriginal people. Rio, I think, has always been a leader in this area. Woodside, after Don Volti came, you know, he hit the ground running and is now a significant employer. And there's a willingness, I think, amongst people to do something about the issues that are out there.
You live this rich life. I mean, we haven't touched on your involvement in education, and you were chair of the school board at John 23rd for quite some time, 9 years or something. UWA Chancellor, art, been on the National Gallery, raised money for not only Wesfarmers but for the gallery. It seems like you're a Renaissance sort of character that can touch many things.
Well, I've been involved in a lot of things, yeah. I don't really consider myself a Renaissance man in the sense that I know a lot of people who are a lot more skilled and erudite and so on in some areas than I am. You know, I'd consider my brother Fred more of a Renaissance man, actually. But I must say I've enjoyed being involved, you know, across a broad section of our community and you know, different causes and organisations. And
you have that lovely woodworking studio.
I have a workshop to beat all workshops, actually. It's a fantastic workshop.
To finish off this stage of the conversation, tell us about the altar at Christ Church at Claremont.
A friend of Fred's, actually, Ron Hawkins, is an architect, and he said to me once, I've got a brief to redesign the front of Christ Church, which is a beautiful old limestone church in Claremont that I'd always admired, and I'd been to one or two weddings in there. And he said, and we need to build a new altar. Would you like to tender for it? Because he knew that I'd built some tables for Notre Dame University. And this is when I was CEO of Wesfarmers. And I said, well, I wouldn't actually like to tender for it, but I might build it for you if you show me the plans. And he showed me the plans, and I thought, yeah, I can do that. So I did it. And but I said to him, the only qualifier is that I can't give you a deadline because I'm travelling a lot and I'll do it when I can. And he said, that's fine. So the priest then called me, the Anglican priest, and he said, that's fantastic news. How about before the 21st of December? And this is in about June. And I said, yeah, all right. And so in the weeks leading up to the 21st of December, I was sort of working away. And the Sunday before that, because he said to me, I've lined up the Archbishop to come and consecrate it. And I thought, gee, this is serious. And so the week before, I said to him, it's ready. And he said, great, I'll come over to your garage and have a look at it. So he came over, and there was, you know, this big square table. And he said, oh, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. I forgot to tell you, we need 4 crosses carved in the top of it. I was due to go to Sydney the next day, so I postponed my trip to Sydney and carved 4 crosses in the top of it the next day. And anyway, we got it ready, and the Archbishop consecrated it. And of course, this is an Anglican altar, which I thought, you know, was quite useful as sort of bit of insurance in case you're on the wrong side.
It's a good Catholic telling that story. You seem, I mean, that story and your love of woodworking and, I might say, gardens too and the like, talks about you really, or gives an insight into you being as a person both of reflection and action. With reflection being not foremost necessarily, but very prominent.
Yeah, I reckon I'd describe myself more as a person of action and reflection in that order. But I guess, yeah, there's a bit of both. I always find it hard to comment, you know, on myself because it's better to ask someone else about it, I think, about you.
You've done a reasonable job. Thank you very much, Michael.
Okay.